Ben-Hur, the classic Ben-Hur story of how love transformed one man's hate for his conquerors and one man's hate for a boyhood friend who had betrayed him during the times of the merciless Roman Empire. A radical message, then, of freeing oneself from the bondage of hate and retribution. If you read the passages from our first scripture lesson in Isaiah, read by Jan, and you read them just by themselves, without any commentary, Isaiah has been given a very specific task, which is oppositional to the religious and hierarchical structure and the expectations of the Hebrew nation. Isaiah is changing the rules of the game as Christ changed the rules of the game when he came. Isaiah writes that not only is the Spirit of the Lord upon him, but that he has been anointed to do the following: to bring good news to the afflicted, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to captives and freedom to prisoners, to comfort all who mourn, not unlike what Jesus was saying in the movie clip. And then we fast forward 600 or 700 years later to the passage in Luke read by Jan again, that you pick up the same Spirit in Jesus' return, Jesus' words, after he has returned from the wilderness, after he has not succumbed to all the temptations, and he basically repeats Isaiah's words in the synagogue. He said, "He, God, has appointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to set free those who are oppressed." It's interesting to note that Isaiah's focus of releasing people from their pain, so to speak, the pain of affliction, the pain of brokenheartedness, the pain of literal imprisonment, the pain of sadness, and the pain of political captivity. Jesus quickly picked up in the Gospel of Luke where Isaiah left off in his inaugural preaching in the synagogue about ministering to and taking care of the poor, the sick, and the captives. In a way, these passages say a lot about the nature of the Christian faith, and they say a lot about the nature of the Christmas message. As the Advent hymn goes, O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel that mourns in lonely exile here until the Son of God appears." Now, the wait for a Messiah in Jesus' days was palpable, considering the circumstances and the conditions that surrounded Jesus' birth. They were anything but idyllic. As a matter of fact, there was a lot of pain and suffering. There were severe health and sanitation issues that were commonly responsible for the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives. There was immense poverty that imprisoned people to desperate conditions without hardly any hope for even a fraction of a better life. There was an average life expectancy in those days of only 30 to 35 years old, at times, of course, predating modern medicine and modern technology. There was isolation and disparagement of those with dreaded diseases, such as leprosy and other fatal diseases. And there was severe political dissent, which was routinely punished by torture and by death. Excerpts from the late Wall Street Journal columnist Vermont Royster has an editorial every Christmas season that includes these words: "There was a persecution of men who dared to think differently. There was enslavement of people whose tribes came not from Rome. There was everywhere a contempt for human life. What to the strong was one more man, more or less, in a crowded world." The world today still fights the struggles of bondage and captivity and still awaits the liberating message from Bethlehem. Last week, the Washington Post published an article on a man by the name of Louis Tiant, a native Cuban and a former Boston Red Sox baseball pitcher, who commented on the political repression in Cuba and the inability of many of his friends to get out of the country to pursue their long-held dreams of playing Major League Baseball in the United States. He said, everyone in life must have the opportunity to be someone, to be able to do what you love, what you dreamed of as a child. They took away that freedom, that happiness, the dreams that one has as a boy. All you wanted to be, but never could. He wanted to talk about the number of people who lost their lives in an effort to escape political oppression. He said, the most difficult thing is that we really don't know the number of people who lost their lives crossing the Gulf of Mexico. If there were 20, if there were 80, if there were 100,000, a million missing. I had a family of friends, about 40 people, who went out in a boat and it broke in half. And they all died. All of them. These are the things that no one knows. No matter the age or the generation, Jesus was born to set the people free from enslavement, no matter in which form it arrived. Jesus says in Luke, to set free those who are oppressed. It would be presumptuous for me to say that in the eyes of God, Jesus came at the opportune time. But at least on the surface, it appears as if he did. Although the world was beginning to taste a reasonable amount of civilization with Rome in charge, there was still despair and despondency with the uninterrupted cycle of violence that perpetuated the Roman Empire. So when Jesus arrived in the unlikeliest of all ways, in a stable and a nondescript town, born to a peasant girl and to a carpenter with no social standing, these events in themselves were signs that God intended to shake up the status quo and to minister not to just one group, not to just the privileged or the poor, or just to the Jews or to the Gentiles, or those on the inside or those on the outside. He came that all may be saved. Thus the scripture's repeated emphasis on those imprisoned by poverty, by political oppression, by sickness, by broken dreams and broken hopes. As Mr. Royster went on to say, then all of a sudden, there was a light in the world, the voice from Galilee that would defy Caesar, offered a new kingdom in which each man could walk upright and bow to none but his God. And later, the Apostle Paul would say to the Galatians, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty where Christ has made us free, and to not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. My friends, Jesus was born in Bethlehem to set us free. Jesus was born in Bethlehem to secure a release from whatever bondage that you may feel in your own life. You see, Jesus' message proclaimed freedom and life beyond any man-made answers. And the best news out of Bethlehem is that Jesus secures a release for all prisoners, captives of guilt, captives of alcohol and drug dependency, captives of materialism, captives of gluttony, captives of anger or envy, captives of anxiety, captives of poor self-esteem, captives of loneliness, captives of depression, captives of defeat and despair. Are you a prisoner to any one of these? If so, are you still waiting for that moment for someone to fling the door open to secure your release? Let Christ come into your heart and secure a release from the bondage in which you find yourself. About 2 months ago, late at night, a call came into my cell phone that I didn't recognize. When I answered, a barely audible voice asked if this was the Reverend. I identified myself and I asked if there was anything I could do to help the caller. He then identified himself as a young man who had been to church here before, and he just so happened to have my phone number because I had called him once to invite him back to church. There was an initial incoherency to his speech and a sound of urgency and desperation. He told me that he had just received news that he had lost his brother out east to a sudden illness. His closeness to his brother, and now the report of his brother's passing, drove this young man that evening to excessive consumption of alcohol and thoughts about taking his own life. As he wandered the west side streets in Manhattan, in the West Loop area, then saying to me at least a couple of times, you know, I'm in a bad state. I'm in a bad state. It was then that I told him to begin walking toward the West Loop McDonald's. I will meet him there in 15 minutes, forgetting that some of the McDonald's lobbies are closed that time of the night, but leave their drive-thrus open. I remember driving on the way there and praying the whole way that I would find him. When I got there, the restaurant stores were closed and already locked. But I saw a young man who I recognized in the lobby, and he'd gotten there just before they closed the doors. And then he let me in. The two of us talked about what was going on. I offered to take him home that evening for him to spend the night at our house. He insisted on not wanting to be in a position. And then we prayed. And I prayed that Christ release him from his despair and despondency so that he could properly mourn his brother's death and celebrate his brother's life, and especially be a source of strength to his family at the time of their greatest need. I dropped him off at his apartment, and then I called him first thing in the morning, and we had him to our house for dinner that night just to keep in touch. But he said to me on the morning after that evening when I called him, he said, "You saved my life." Well, it's the kind of statement that makes one take a big gulp and then feeling your emotions well up inside you. And then after the emotions calmed down, the understanding that it was really God who saved his life. The obscure number of mine still in his call log. The doors of McDonald's still open when he got there. And God's words through a messenger that helped release the young man from his fears and his loneliness. You know, when I was a youth leader, there was a beautiful Bob Dylan song that the high school youth loved to sing. And they sang it in beautiful harmony. The name of the song was, "I Shall Be Released." And it went like this: I see my light come shining from the west unto the east. Any day now, I shall be released. It is Christ who saves. It is Christ who releases you from whatever is holding you back. It is Christ that gives you the freedom to live life abundantly.